Ukraine needs soldiers, but it's struggling to find them. Conscription rules are in force, but getting young men to go fight is proving hard. But those on the front line say there's no other way.
First of all, we need more people. Of course, I realize that war is terrible. No normal person without mental disorders wants to fight. But lately, you are no longer thinking about the fact that you don't have ammunition, you don't have drones, you don't have something else, something else, something else. You think about the fact that there are some positions that there's no one to replace. I don't know how to motivate the youth. I entered the army by myself. I decided to go by myself. Acquaintances tried to talk me out of it, but I went on my own. How to motivate them? I say, if you don't want the Russians to come to you, then you go and drive them away. Because at this pace, with such losses, morale and physical condition, everyone is tired, everyone's exhausted. I have my illnesses, my boys have other illnesses. And if there's no fresh recruitment, then there's no fight, it will not end, and we will lose the war.
Is conscription, therefore, existential for Ukraine? And is that why Ukraine is forcing its young men to fight? That's what we're discussing here today on News Desk. I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome.
And I'm Michelle Stockman, and I will be paying special attention to your comments, your questions that are in the chat. So please put them in there. And thanks to all of you who have already commented. I just want to bring out a couple of those already. First of all, we've got Crypto Rose saying, personally, conscription is generally wrong, but people who are acting like their country wouldn't do the same thing if they were invaded are just dumb. And then there's another one I found in our community chat before the show from N. Srini 1971 saying, send all politicians, journalists, and their relatives to the war front. You will see the war will end within a few days. World needs peace and progress. Well, Bresh, I have definitely thought about that as a journalist. You know, we've got skin in the game, but not necessarily really skin in the game. And journalists and politicians are decision makers in this. But to really get the war to stop, you need both sides.
But I'm not really sure if journalists are decision makers. I mean, I'd like to hear what Armin has to say, who's been to the front line.
Maybe
on
decision
numerous
influencers,
occasions.
maybe.
Yeah, but it's not decision makers. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Armin.
Well, that is a good question because a lot of journalists are actually going into the trenches and
they're
are in
not
harm's
fighting,
way.
right?
Right. I think the comment is probably mostly about the media in general, just kind of like, you know, since the beginning of the Ukraine war, Western media has been sympathetic to the need for military equipment and soldiers. And I think that comment is probably talking to this idea that, like, we can sit here and talk about, okay, is conscription good for the military? Is it bad for Ukraine in the long term? But if you personally were served a draft order by a police officer, what would you be thinking? Would you say, okay, yeah, fine, I'm going to go to the trenches and maybe die in the next 6 months, you know? It'd be like, for some people, worse than finding out they had cancer. So I think there's a lot of emotions in this situation. I think it's true that a lot of journalists are far away from where the action is happening and can judge people for making their own decisions, but it's a lot more serious when that decision is your decision.
Haven't some journalists, I mean, those who were working as journalists in Ukraine, been forced to fight on the front line?
Yeah, that's another issue.
As ordinary citizens, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you're...
Not because they were journalists, but because they were of a certain age.
Because they're males in Ukraine and of a certain age, and then they can fight. And a lot of them volunteered in the beginning of the war. Some journalists decided, I want to fight. I can't sit here and hold a camera. I want to hold a gun. So. Yeah.
Well, let's not forget Cherry, though. Cherry also is involved in the chat. And tell us what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I'm quite glad that the chat has been quite lively already. We started just a few minutes ago, and people have been talking already. And we also have a poll question today for everyone. The poll question is conscription fair when a country is at war? There are three options. The first, only if everyone is treated fairly. Or no one should be forced to fight. Or there's no other way. So we will discuss the results later in our discussion. And so don't forget to vote. And you can find the poll on top of your live chat.
So be sure to vote. We are curious to hear what you all think. We are already getting a taste of what you all are thinking at the moment. So keep those comments coming in and those observations as well. Just to go back to Armin, who's a special correspondent whom you all have seen on DW News. And if you all are a subscriber of the channel, you all have seen him on the DW News YouTube page. Armin just returned from Ukraine. I forget exactly. You told me where you were. You were in Kyiv, definitely.
Yeah.
There was another place, I'm forgetting where you were. And if you could tell us where that was and what exactly are the laws to do with conscription that are currently in effect in Ukraine right now?
Yeah. I was in Kyiv and also in Western Ukraine in Shepetivka. It's a small town, 40,000 people before the war anyway. And I actually filmed with a group of young people between the ages of 12 and 17. I think the oldest one was 17, who had like an after-school club where they did military drills and training for military. So looking at the future of Ukraine's military, young kids who actually want to be soldiers when they grow up and are training to be professional soldiers.
What kind of training?
Yeah, they're kind of led by a military commander or a junior lieutenant in the air defense, and she has some experience, and so she taught them like how to dismantle and reassemble a Kalashnikov. They do like little practice drills where they're, if you're in a firing line, you don't want your comrade to be in front of you, that kind of thing. So basic training for the military.
But these are students up to the age of 17, right?
Yeah,
and in Ukraine, so basically kids, those below 18 don't need to fight, or is it above 25?
Yeah,
I'm always confused.
Right. So the conscription law is confusing. Also for Ukrainians, it's confusing. There's a lot of bureaucracy, like in any country, when you're dealing with something on this scale. So the law is right now, every man between the ages of 18 and 60 is required to register for the draft. So as an American, we don't have a draft, but I have to register for the draft, and that's how it works in a lot of countries. So that's a little bit separate from being conscripted into the military. Everybody between 18 and 60 has to register. Now, between 25 and 60, you could actually be mobilized. So once you registered, then the military can say, we need more men, we're going to take 1,000 now, we're going to take the fittest 1,000. So they go through their documents and they see, okay, this person in Shepetivka or Kyiv, they're now going to be recruited into the military. So they have to register. A lot of men haven't done that because it's very hard to enforce. And what you've seen is that Zelensky passed just in April, and then it came into effect in May, a new conscription law, which was very unpopular for a lot of people in Ukraine, but for other people, they said it was necessary. They need a lot more men, so they passed this new conscription law that made a couple of changes. The first one is it dropped the conscription age, so the mobilization age, from 27 to 25, so younger men could be drafted into the military. It changed the rules so that any Ukrainian men living abroad, and there's millions of them, so Ukrainian passport holders, some of them have been living abroad since they were kids, some of them in the past 10 years, they actually have to register for the draft now. So if they're over 18, they have to go to their consulate and say, okay, here's my information. You can't get a new passport or renew your documents if you haven't registered for the draft if you're living abroad. So that's affected probably millions of Ukrainian men. And another thing that Zelensky did was made it a lot easier to stop men on the street and check their documents. So now you have to carry your documents with you to show, okay, I'm over 18 and I've registered for the draft. And if you don't do that, then you're not in compliance, and you could have pay a fee or get your driver's license taken away and things like this. And the thing is that you can see the change in Ukraine. For most of the war, it wasn't really spoken about. It was kind of like, some people did register, some people didn't, but nobody really knew who didn't and who did. And now you can see groups of police officers on the street just wandering around with a clipboard and stopping people. Some of our journalists who have already registered, and so they're in full compliance, but they've been stopped for the first time in 2 years of war on the street by officers who want to check their papers.
These are journalists you work with when you're back in Ukraine? These are journalists you work with when you're back in Ukraine, is that right?
What's that?
These are journalists you work with when you're back in Ukraine?
Yeah, exactly, Ukrainian journalists.
Can you just explain to us, you said men between the ages of 18 to 60 have to register, but the fighting age is only above 25 and above. So why register if you're under 25?
I think that's in place in all countries that have had some kind of draft in the past, like in the US. You have to register once you're 18 because you become an adult, and so now you're on the books, basically. But I think practically it's because now they can lower the conscription age without having to get everybody to register already. So they want to make sure that these people are on file. Plus, who knows how long the war is going to go on. If it continues for another 5 years or so, then these people are going to be eligible to fight if the draft age is lowered even more.
So if you're a Ukrainian man and you're over 18, you should be informing the Ukrainian military where you are.
Yeah.
And that what your status is in terms of being able to fight.
Yeah, you have to go to your local office and say, okay, I'm here, and then you do a medical exam too, because don't forget there's deferments. So it's not like everybody who signs up for the draft is going to be taken and sent to the front lines. If you have a medical problem, if you're a student, you don't have to fight. If you have a job that is considered necessary to support the country, so if you work in the defense industry, if you're a civil servant, if you're a judge, if you're a police officer, then you can get a deferment and you don't have to fight in the military.
Sorry, Matthew. I know.
Go ahead.
Matthew, though, is before you. Matthew said, we're talking about men here, but Matthew says, why is Ukraine's government only focusing on drafting men? There are millions of women who could be conscripted.
Yeah.
About the women.
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, it does not affect the women. Okay. What you have seen is that a lot of women have volunteered. Either they've signed up to join the military. Ukraine's military is very diverse. You don't see that many women in the trenches loading the cannons and stuff like that, but you do see a lot of women in the military, either in air defense, like this lieutenant that I met, or you see a lot of women in medical services, and you see a lot of women volunteering. So there's, besides the military, you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are volunteering. So they're going with their own funds, their own tools and everything to go help the soldiers, usually medical or delivering supplies, doing logistics work and stuff like that. And that's where you see like a lot of women.
So going back to what you were just saying earlier, that they are enforcing for the first time since the war began this requirement to register and enlist at enlistment centers to at least provide their data so that the government can decide whether they want to mobilize you or not. They're enforcing that quite a lot. Where has that left the mood in Ukraine? I mean, are people okay with that? Are people still as patriotic as ever and doesn't really matter to them? Or what is the mood?
First of all, I know that a lot of Ukrainians get upset when they see Western media portraying Ukraine as like a divided society because of the mobilization, the conscription. It's not a divided society. If you go there, you see still a lot of unity. The Russian invasion is a serious, it's a horrible thing for most Ukrainians. Even in Kyiv, where the coffee shops are open, it feels like normal life, but that's just because people have gotten used to the bombs exploding in the middle of the night. And the air raid sirens constantly, and their friends and family dying on the front lines. So it's not back to normal, and the country is very much in favor of their military. They're divided over how that should be done, how long they should fight, what their demands should be, how long it should take before they negotiate with Russia, things like that. But there is a lot of unity. So the second part of my answer is that the context is really important here, because there was a lot of hope in, let's say, summer last year, before Ukraine's second counteroffensive against Russia. The first counteroffensive, if you remember, pushed a lot of the Russians out of the Kyiv region, out of the Kharkiv region. Even in the south, they took back Kherson. And so you saw a lot of momentum on the Ukrainian side. They had a second counteroffensive that lasted until about November, and it failed. They made no gains, and a lot of people were depressed. The winter came. Russia started bombing infrastructure again, lights went out, things like that. And so there's a sense there that the front line is fixed. Russia has a little bit of momentum right now, but generally the front line is fixed. And so that raises a lot of questions. Thousands of people are still dying weekly. Thousands of soldiers are dying on the front line. The question of whether or not you who have been living the past 2 years as an engineer or whatever, supporting Ukraine's military, are you going to go to the front line and die in like a World War I style fixed front line if there's no prospect in the next 5 years of gaining any territory back? So that has changed the mood, and a lot of people are talking openly, which was a very taboo subject at the beginning of the war. A lot of people are talking openly now about how to avoid ending up on the front line, whether or not that means leaving the country, either by illegal means or legal means, and then not coming back, or if that means actually signing up for the military and getting a job where you don't have to go to the front line, but you're maybe in charge of some personnel and, doing an office job in the military.
And you did speak to somebody, right, who does live abroad and has been able to avoid a conscription, right? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's right. It's somebody that I've been talking to since the beginning of the war, because he had a particular case which sounds a little bit like maybe he was the only guy that this happened to, but I found hundreds of guys that were in his predicament. So they're men who live abroad. Like me, I live in Germany, but I'm a U.S. passport holder. My whole life is here in Germany. Their whole life was somewhere else in the world. They happened to be in Ukraine when the war broke out, and then martial law went into effect, and any man over 18 couldn't leave Ukraine anymore. So they were kind of stuck in a country that seems like their home, but isn't really their home.
Isn't where their
So
life
that
is,
was
their
his
job,
situation.
their
Exactly.
family, maybe. Okay,
Right.
interesting.
He was able to get back out of Ukraine through bureaucratic measures. I mean, it was possible, actually, at that point, to get out of Ukraine as a resident abroad.
This is last year, or?
Yeah, that was in 2022, so first year of the full-scale
okay.
war. But now with the new mobilization law, even if you're a resident abroad, you're supposed to come back to Ukraine to fight, basically. That's what Ukraine is asking for. So I talked to him again to ask how the mobilization law affects him, and we can listen to what he said.
I heard about these new changes. As I understand, they requested even for those people who live abroad to be registered in some special system. And funny part, they said, like, if you live abroad and you don't have any, let's say, IDs which allow you to do some remote stuff, you have to visit Ukraine, and register with this special TCK, they call it. I'm not sure how to translate it in English. So it's places where actually the recruitment is in place. So frankly, I'm not going to do that because I do understand if I will travel to Ukraine, I will stuck once again, and definitely probably this time till the end of the war. And I will have only probably two choices. One choice is to be put in the army and to be on front line. Another choice is, I'm not sure, maybe to be jailed because of not my willing to do so. So yeah. Anyway, I'm still support Ukraine. Actually, funny part of overall this, I'm paying taxes in US. So as you remember, US they provided this huge amount of money to support Ukraine, like financially and the military stuff. And actually, part of this money is my money as well, for sure.
So yeah, I'm playing that from my laptop because I did the interview with him yesterday. But yeah,
I get a sense of that divide, internal divide, because you said, people in Ukraine, they really are united, and yet there is that internal divide. He says he supports Ukraine. He pays taxes to the U.S., which is sending aid to Ukraine, but yet not willing to put his life on the line, not thinking it's worth it.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that a lot of men in his situation are not only... so I talked to other men that he put me in contact with. One of the guys actually was living in Poland for years, had his whole family there, wife and two very small kids. And he went to Ukraine after the war broke out to fight because he used to be a soldier. So he fought, and then he did like 3 months or something, and then he wanted to go back to Poland just for a little while to get his affairs in order, see his family. He also had a business that he was running, so he wanted to go back to get his affairs in order, but he couldn't get out of the country. So finally, when he managed to get like the passport stamp and everything, he got out of the country, he's like, I'm not going back. So his plan was originally to keep coming back to fight in Ukraine, but because of the restrictions, it actually encouraged him to not come back to Ukraine. So there is this kind of secondary effect where people who would support Ukraine in certain ways are deciding against that because the incentives are not in their favor.
Speaking of the effect that this has, for example, with this person whom you interviewed, based on what he's saying, it effectively means as long as this war is on, he can't travel back to Ukraine, or he'll be trapped,
or he'll be stuck, And he has family there. It also means that he couldn't get his passport renewed. So if his Ukrainian passport expires before the war is over, then he can't get a new passport. And we saw, maybe we could play that video. We saw, once this law was put into effect, huge lines outside of Ukrainian embassies across the world because people living abroad were afraid that they weren't going to get a passport. And
that was earlier this year. Oh, yeah, April.
That was in Warsaw, I think. Yeah, that was in Warsaw. This is in the embassy in Warsaw, if I'm not wrong. And the moment that this law was announced, people queuing up to try and renew their passports and their documents, but then, facing troubles, as one can see.
And just putting morality and ethics aside, whether or not you judge these people for not returning to Ukraine to fight, just look from a sociological perspective. There's a lot of people making the argument that what is their incentive now to go back to Ukraine? The government did this in order to get more recruits from abroad, because there are millions of men, eligible men, living abroad. So they want these men to fight on their front lines so they can defend Ukraine. But what is their incentive to do that? Their incentive is actually to stay in the other country because they know that if they go back, then they're going to get stuck. And
What did the government have to say? What is the government's position on why they should come back and fight?
The foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, actually was asked that by a journalist, and we have a recording of that.
I think we have a soundbite, don't
Yeah.
we? Potentially.
It's fair towards Ukrainian men who stayed in Ukraine and who work in the Ukrainian economy and who fight in the Ukrainian army. I think it will be fair towards them if men from abroad return to Ukraine and stand by them, by each other, in defending their country, the country that gave them everything.
And just for the record, that was Dmitry Kuleba speaking in Kyiv on the 26th of April earlier this year. And this was just about the time that this new mobilization law that Armin was talking about came into effect, that it basically suspended consular services for men of fighting age, basically between 18 to 60 years of age, requiring them to register with the potential that they might get called to Ukraine based on that data, correct?
That's right. Yeah, and I put this question to Andy too, because obviously the question that people have brought up with him is the same one that Dmitry Kuleba was talking about, is the sense of duty. So if you're Ukrainian, born in Ukraine, your Ukrainian passport, then the constitutional idea is that it's your duty to protect your country when your country calls you up. So I was curious what he thought about that, and we can, I can show you what he told me.
Once again, I live in US, right? I pay my US taxes, which has huge amounts of money, right, annual. So, and as you remember, Ukraine got all the support from the US, financial support, weapons, ammo, and so on. So it's a simple question: who pays for that? Answer is American taxpayers. I am one of them, actually, right? So I believe that my support over this way is more efficient. I would to be on the front line. I'm not well prepared private soldier, and so yeah, I would say, and for sure, I do remember I donated to get a helmet for my friend, for example, because it was a lack of ammunition in the Ukraine, so I sent it from the US to Ukraine, so and this way, yeah. And moreover, it's funny story regarding people who are living abroad. I know a story. One guy who was and still volunteer. He was getting pickup trucks from Europe to Ukraine to support army. He was crossing the border all the time. And last time he's stuck in Ukraine because he wasn't allowed to leave the country because he has Ukrainian citizenship still. So, crazy. It should be. I don't understand that overall the situation is once again it's hard, but it's something you have to decide what is your option, right? Not someone pushing you, hey, you should do that, and so on, and you have no choice at all. I know it's war, but once again, comparing, let's say, with Russia, I know it's maybe a strange comparison, but they don't have such restrictions to leave the country, right? So I know that people living in Russia, they still allowed to travel abroad. For sure, they have this hidden process of getting new recruits in army. But anyway, so and once again, Ukraine is building democratic country, or they want to have the same Russia or North Korea, or I don't know. So I know it sounds like I'm against maybe Ukraine. It's not, because definitely I support, but government should not push so hard, because if they have idea okay, we are going to reach of our territory back 1991, come on guys, it's this is your goal you have, it's too much, right? So and people I know people like they sometimes they're going to disappoint with Ukraine because, okay, I was supporting you, I was trying my best. I don't want to fight, but I'm still trying to help you, and you like push me in such a way that sorry, it sounded like we have built not a democratic country, but some regime, right? Even with saying like, okay, in the future it will be fine, but no, I'm against it.
He made quite a few points over there. He talked about not being well prepared to fight, and the fact that he's doing his bit because he's an American taxpayer, and therefore some of that money is going to Ukraine. But it's just, I'd like to ask you, because you've known him for some time, Ami, and he was talking about it is the government essentially. He's not prepared to listen to the government telling him to go fight. It should be his own personal decision, almost suggesting that it's non-democratic for the government to suggest that. But Ukraine is currently under martial law because of an extraordinary situation that the Ukrainian government didn't choose to be in. And if I'm not wrong, the Ukrainian government itself didn't really want to go down this conscription route for the longest time, right?
Well, it was put in place since the very beginning, the closing the borders. I think that's the biggest issue to Andy, is this restriction on the borders, because he's been, since 2012, he's been going in and out of Ukraine. So that's his main issue, and that's what he takes the government to task for, which was pretty unusual. It was criticized even from the beginning of being a kind of Soviet-era relic, so to speak. He mentioned that Russia did not actually have that put in place at the beginning, which is true. I mean, since then, Russia has made it more difficult. People who have already been processed for the draft cannot leave the country, but men between the ages of 18 and 60 or whatever, they can leave the country as long as they haven't been drafted yet, things like that. So it's not necessarily, it's not all countries that have this law, or at least in that particular situation. But that's maybe an interesting question to put to the people watching on YouTube right now. How do you feel about that? Do you think a government can recruit the necessary amount of soldiers to defend the country without forcing men to do it? And I think that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of, it's not just a moral question, like I said earlier. It's like the U.S. has the biggest military in the world, and we don't have a draft. So it is possible to get people to.
But you did have to register for a draft. I didn't know that about the United States. I really didn't know that.
The chat does, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so definitely we're hearing from people who agree with Andy. Folka saying if men don't want to return, that is their right of the freedom of movement. They should have the right to choose. However, looking at what he says what he has decided to contribute is more efficient. Being a U.S. taxpayer is more efficient for him to support the war effort. But with the way the war is going right now, that's a question we also had from, let's see, Ramiro C. With Russia, does Russia have the upper hand in the war? And what kind of support does Ukraine need from the men of Ukraine to actually stay in the fight right now? Do they need people giving money from abroad, or do they need men at the front line?
Well, one thing that we were reading earlier was this study that said for every soldier, you need 4 or 5 people basically working to prop up that soldier. So that's the conundrum here. Of course, you need men who are willing to die for their country. Without that, you don't have a military. But without many more people behind that person, and it's also women, fighting on the front lines, you need an economy to prop that up. There's a lot of people making the point now that if Ukraine wins just through sheer endurance and manpower, what's the economy going to look like after? Is it going to be a country willing to fight for if you throw your entire working population into the trenches to fight, then what does a country look like after? And don't forget that Ukraine is struggling from a serious demographic problem that's unheard of in the rest of Europe. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of people stopped making babies, they left the country, so you have this huge drop in population right in that sweet spot of military recruitment. So men in their 20s are men and women in their 20s are the lowest demographic in the country. You have much higher population when you start getting into the 40s and 50s. So that's why the Ukrainian military is a very old military, because not just because young guys don't want to fight, but because there just aren't that many young guys in the country.
I think the average age was somewhere in the 40s, right? Like 40, 43 or something
Yeah.
like that. Just wanted to ask you, so you've registered at one of these enlistment centers, and then you get called up, you get drafted. Is it a given that you will go on the front line to fight, or could you be in like a support role on the front line, for example, I don't know, as a drone operator, not necessarily somebody who has to be in the trenches all the time doing trench warfare? I mean, is it a given that if you get drafted, you're going to the front line to sit in the trenches and fight, or you could be doing something else?
Well, just a quick, very interesting aside is that what we've seen in the war in Ukraine is that drone operators have become the frontline fighters. So when we talk about the trenches in Ukraine, some people would rather be in the trenches than being a drone pilot, because the drone pilots go out into the field exposing themselves and have to sit there to get a connection. And these FPV drones, these small little drones that you would get to like film a little soccer match or whatever, they're attaching bombs to them, and this is the manpower. This is what they're using to fight Russians, and Russians are fighting back. So drone pilots are dying at the highest rate, one of the highest rates among soldiers. So a lot of young people have thought, okay, I can become a drone pilot and not have to like shoot in the trenches. They turn out to be sadly wrong, that that's actually extremely dangerous job.
It's not like in the U.S. where you're a continent away and operating a drone, like you're out in the front line. Okay.
You could if you have the massive, sophisticated drones that the Americans have, which they've sent to Ukraine, but you need thousands of drones to actually have an effect. They're being used like little bombs, basically. So the question is, can you get a job where you're not necessarily going to die within the first week? There are a lot of these jobs, but this is a much broader question that I can't speak to scientifically, but what you hear people talking about in Ukraine is that to get a job where you are not facing danger in the military, you have to be well-connected, well-educated, and in some ways wealthy.
Okay, I'd just like to expand this discussion a bit by bringing in a guest. But before I do that, I'll not give the name of the guest as yet. But before we do that, let's just take a quick check on where we are with the chat with Cherry, who's been monitoring this. I believe from the little that I've been watching, and you've been seeing a lot more of this than I have, but there's a lot of comments. People are reacting quite a bit. So what generally have the reactions been along the lines of?
This discussion in the chat has been quite polarized, but first of all, I want to point out that someone gave you praise, Amin, specifically. He said that, the person said that you have answered many questions that the person has always wondered about, and you're very knowledgeable and specific.
I'm seeing this. This is David Cerullo, right?
Oh, yeah.
David Cerullo.
Yeah.
That's the one chat I saw.
And all right, so about the opinions, there are some people who express a very strong sense of duty as a citizen when it comes to conscription. For example, Jamie S. Says that anyone fit for service who renounces duty to their country renounces their citizenship in turn. But there are also people who are not questioning conscription specifically, but questioning if conscription is worth it at this point. For example, there's a comment saying that the reason why they don't fight is because Ukraine is losing the war. If they were winning, they would have no problem getting recruits. Also, their friends are all dead. So the opinion about conscription has been quite polarized in the chat.
Okay.
I just want to add to that. Niraz139 says, who is dying? Just poor people who didn't have much money to flee the country. So there is that sense of what you were just saying. There's a sense or feeling, definitely, that the privileged are able to avoid this fight.
You see that in every country. It's not just Ukraine for sure, but there is a big gap between the rich and the poor. And what you see, it's in black and white. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see that the deferments that you can get besides medical or being too old or too young to fight is you're a student of higher education, you are a civil servant, or you are a CEO of a company. And so look at these jobs, like a PhD student or a master's student, civil servant, and CEO. You have to be part of a certain class to get those deferments. So there are certain, if you're a farmer or a construction worker, you don't really have that many options open to you. And you see that in every country. So it's not a criticism against the Ukrainian government necessarily, but it is true that if you're poor, you have a higher chance of fighting. But just on that deferment, I mean, I know that we have some visuals of a forger who was caught in the city of Odessa, and maybe we can just bring that up. And the reason I'm talking about forgeries is, so there's the Ukrainian services, from the state border guard. This is they're arresting a woman, I think, who was allegedly involved
in a plan to counterfeit disability certificates. And she was apparently charging clients, get this, $11,000 for her services for a disability certificate. So it is only if you are rich will you be able to afford a certificate for one person that costs $11,000, which is way more than the national average salary, I'd imagine, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, the annual salary is probably higher than that. I think it's around 20,000 euros, but that's a life savings for somebody who's living hand to mouth, especially. But it is true that these documents for medical deferrals were huge economy, especially at the beginning when people didn't know how the war was going to end up. They didn't know if Kiev or Lviv were going to be safe, and so they left the country. And you saw a lot of people doing that. What you saw with this latest conscription law that Zelensky just passed is that anybody who had a medical deferral that wasn't in a certain class, so if you were in a wheelchair or something like that, they have to undergo another medical exam to have that rechecked, and they have to do that immediately, so by mid-July or something. So they're trying to crack down on people who maybe had like an injury, like they broke their ankle or something at the beginning of the war and they had a temporary medical deferral, but 2 years later their ankle's healed and they could serve in the military.
Let's talk about the government's options. And for this part of this conversation, I'd like to finally introduce our guest who's been waiting patiently, Frank Ledwidge, a former UK military intelligence officer and a senior lecturer in strategic studies at Portsmouth University. Frank, of course, is not new to DW News or to Newsdesk. If you all are subscribers of the DW News YouTube channel, you've probably seen him talking to a whole host of news anchors here at DW. Frank, thanks so much for making the time, and thank you for waiting patiently and joining in the discussion. It's great that you can join us. I just wanted to ask you, there's a number of things that we were discussing here, but first up, this new mobilization law that Ukraine has passed, was this totally unavoidable? Did Ukraine absolutely have to do this? Is that where Ukraine is at this stage in the war? It needs more bodies?
Great to be with you, Baresh. It's an honour as usual. So the answer to the last question is absolutely, and it follows the pattern historically of similar conflicts. And the one that I have in mind, not just because I'm British, but because the population's similar and the urgency was similar. It's the First World War in the UK and England for Britain. So you had a population of 35 million or so, were taking huge casualties. There came a point about 18 months into the war where they'd run out of volunteers, and that's the same in Ukraine. Similarly too, and this is something I don't think has been touched on yet, but I'd like to touch on it, is casualties. But there came a point where they simply ran out of volunteers. Recently, I think the latest poll, this would be in May, I think, indicated, which plays into this strongly, anti-previous interviewee, that only 35% of those who haven't volunteered so far would be willing to serve if they were let's say, either pressed or conscripted or forced to volunteer, whatever we want to put it. I go to Kiev quite often, and I was really struck by a conversation. Of course, it's always good to talk to taxi drivers, but I asked him why he hadn't joined the army. And of course, not the first person I asked, but he said, well, first of all, I've got the requisite amount of kids, which is 3, so I don't need to go. But secondly, he said, the pay is quite good on the zero line, as they call it, which is the front line, right, up against the Russians, doing whatever task you have. It's about $2,000 a month, actually. But he said, you don't last very long. I would expect to be out of there in three days or so, hopefully injured, he said, and then I'll be on $12 a month. And it was said before about the US military. I think this is really important. Yes, the US military can recruit, has 3 million service members, 700,000 or so civilians, but let's say 2.1, 2.2 million. It's worth remembering the conditions of service they have. And that's also the way the Russians have been recruiting. They've been giving their troops, I think your average salary now is between $1,700, $2,200 a month for the Russian army, for the volunteers now that pour in 20 to 30,000 a month. And then, of course, if you're killed, it's a pretty dismal conversation to have, but your family gets a significant bounty. Same for Wagner, and that's how we calculate Wagner casualties. So the inducements are, there are perverse inducements, let's say, involved. But if you're Ukrainian and you have a choice and you haven't gone, it's a pretty dismal prospect. And that's before we get into the reason they have to do this, which is casualties. And I would estimate, based on the latest US figures, which were 6 months or so ago now, which indicated about 70,000 killed. So we're looking probably into six figures for the Ukrainians killed, and another 200,000 or so injured. So you see that of an army of 800,000 to 1 million, you're taking huge casualties. And those need to be replaced. And of course, then there's the training burden. So all of this plays into a situation that's, I wouldn't say it's desperate, but it's really difficult for the Ukrainians. And just as one final token before I finish this peroration, the original number, and this I think has been mentioned already, was 500,000. General Zaluzhny, who was chief of staff at the time, mentioned that number. But then the next command staff analysis indicated that they simply won't be getting that this year. So they revised it down. I think that number is confidential. But they won't be getting 500,000 this year. And even if they did, they couldn't train them. Lots more to be said, but I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Frank, we've got a question here from William Gary. You were just talking about training. So people who are conscripts, what kind of training will they receive? Gary says you will last longer if you are trained better. So what kind of training are people getting and how much?
To some extent, it depends on whether you volunteer, for whom you volunteer, which service, the National Guard, or the regular army, or the territorial defence brigades. So as one indicator, I saw an advert in Kiev last time I was there about 4 weeks ago, which I think was advertising for the 13th National Guard Brigade, which offered you a guaranteed 12 weeks or 60 days training. So that was their inducement. I don't suspect, I think a lot of people don't get that. If you're lucky, you may get a 3-month package in Poland, UK, France, or one of the other NATO countries, which essentially comprises, I think about 5 or 6 weeks of combat training. It's worth saying that NATO troops, as William is probably aware, get a minimum of 12 weeks basic, plus you get on top of that your what we call in the UK phase 2, which is your specialist training. Mm-hmm. So everyone gets basic infantry training, and then you get your specialist training. So they're nowhere near as well trained as the most basically trained NATO troops.
Wow.
Just speaking of inducements, you were talking about the financial inducements and comparing it to what, say, the Russians are providing right now. Ukraine has been getting a lot of money, financial assistance, particularly from the European Union, from the Americans. Is that not sufficient to provide those required inducements on par with what the Russians are providing, or even better?
Yeah, Baresh, thanks for that. Yeah, that's correct. And as soon as they got the package from the US, an announcement was made. I think it was very late April, that pay would be going up for everybody. Mm-hmm. I think the basic pay now is about, and somebody will correct me here, about $700, and it goes up to $2,200. This is, mm-hmm. So it's about 100,000 hryvnia when you put all the allowances together. But only if you're on the front line. If you're not on the front line, it's considerably less than that. And the problem arises, really, from my perspective, as someone who's dealt a lot with veterans and those who are disabled, is if you're hospitalised, that goes way down, and you're into derisory pay. Then I'm not sure that's changed, but yeah, the offer, as we call it in the UK, went significantly up, I think, for everybody in early May. But again, it doesn't. It's not for everybody. If you're on the front lines, it's significantly greater. If you're not, it's about the average, slightly more than the average national salary. But at least you're going to get it now.
I just want to bring up a point that Armian was able to raise, because Armian he just returned from Ukraine, and Armian, you spoke to Andy, who's in the United States, who's been able to avoid conscription because he's a long-term resident of the United States. I think one of the points that Andy was making from Florida, was it? Where was he? Yeah. From Florida. The point he was making is about why the borders need to be closed, because Andy, in essence, if he comes back to Ukraine, he'll not be able to leave because he's of fighting age and he might be called up for a draft. So the point that he was raising in the interview that Armian did was, why does Ukraine need to, in essence, close its borders, imprisoning, in effect, its fighting age population when other countries are not doing that? Why does Ukraine need to do this?
I think it thinks that there will be mass, or rather large numbers of men, young and old, who will leave the country, and they may be right. I mean, tens of thousands have been stopped on the border so far. And I think there's a growing, and look, I mean, we'll get onto the military situation, but I think there's a growing awareness that if you're conscripted, you're unlikely to end up in one big piece. You may not be killed. And that the number of volunteers willing volunteers, I should say, as opposed to pressed men, is reducing. I suspect that's the policy. That's the policy behind it, and that may have some validity.
Is there a good way to implement conscription that works in democratic nations?
Well, there are several models. There's the draft where everybody gets. I mean, it was mentioned before. The US still technically has a draft, and that's in case of war. And they've had that, I think. I mean, I'll be corrected here. I think since 40. No, anyway, we don't have a draft. People are talking now about conscription. The way to have done it, whether it's a conscription model or a draft ballot, like in the US, where you draw a number and you're called up if you get the right or the wrong number, depending on your perspective, is initially to have a national register of those liable for conscription. And the Ukrainians did not have that until earlier this year, as far as I understand. Now they do have that, which is why you see the press gangs, as I would call them, being of a naval background, with their tablets going around cities inquiring as to people's status. Now that's only been put into operation, I think, this year. Surprising, really, because they've been at war since 2014. But look, this has been a political bomb, if you like, for the last 9 or 10 years, and they really only resolved it recently with the most recent conscription regulations and the several laws that 4,000 or so new regulations that were brought into service only this year. So they have got moving quickly, but rather late. So the model to come back to the point, the model to have followed would be to have a full list, agree your exemptions, make them politically acceptable, and ensure that everybody knew their position within that. So, for example, for the British conscription model during the First World War and the Second, you knew when your date was coming up, or at least you'd have some idea.
Right.
Whereas that's not the case now.
If I may jump on something that Frank brought up earlier too, is the context of the prospects that men face when they are drafted or conscripted into the military. So one part of the new mobilization law, the new conscription law, was hotly debated. Are we going to have a demobilization law? Because a lot of people wanted that to happen before the new conscription law took effect, because men want to know, if I'm going to sign up for the military, is this a one-way ticket, or am I going to have a prospect of surviving and coming back to my family? Because I think you'd have to be pretty crazy to go to the front lines if you thought it was certain death. And I think no country could have a military if everybody thought they were all going to die at the end of the war. So that was hotly debated. It actually didn't make it into the conscription law, which angered a lot of military people who were pushing for conscription, because they want to know that the men who volunteered at the beginning of the war to fight have some prospect that at a certain point they're legally required to be given time back home. And there's also the question of rotation. It's not just demobilization, but maybe the people at the front line could be pulled into the back end of things, and then other soldiers who have the proper training could be moved up to the front line. But right now, Ukraine actually doesn't have a plan for that. It's supposed to be coming in the next weeks or months, but so far it hasn't made it through Parliament.
Go ahead. We've been having a lot of that today.
I know we have. We want to say something. No, but what I do want to say is that has come through in the chat. People questioning the Ukrainian government's rollout of conscription from the start. Should they have actually started from a younger age, not 27, but actually started at 18, so they would have those replacement soldiers that they do need now? That's a criticism that's come through in the chat. But we had a more recent question. I'm going to pose this to Frank from Andrew Uchi, talking about the number of soldiers in the Ukrainian army. He says, and you have to fact checked it for me, Frank. Zelensky boasted earlier in the war that he had 800,000 men, or was it 1 million? What happened to them? Or are they losing more men than Russia? Can you comment on the need for soldiers on the ground?
Yeah, if I can just deal quickly with the age thing, and it did come up before, so I'm just glossing on it really, is that they have a particular problem between 17 going on 18 now and 23, 24. So you see that the population deficit, if you like, goes like this for that age. So that's why they don't have the younger age, and they probably won't go on to that. But eventually, if the war goes on, of course, that population dip will move into the conscription zone of 24, 25, and that'll be a real problem. But back to the specific question. Yes, no, look, the numbers in Ukrainian service remain, as I understand it, correctly, I think, a national secret, probably rightly so. The usual figure is, as was said, about 800,000, of which I think around 300,000 are on or near the zero line. But any military needs huge logistical and support and backup and organisation, and that accounts for the numbers. But of course, if you take out of that the considerable casualties, you're going to face a continuing reduction of that number if you can't recruit what you're losing through being killed, seriously injured, captured. There are many thousands of Ukrainian soldiers being captured, and of course missing, which amounts to probably, well, I regret to say it, but it's most likely in an artillery war that if you're missing, you're likely to be dead. So it's those numbers they're trying to make up. There's one other factor I mean, it was really remiss of me to miss that point, quite rightly mentioned, about demobilization. There's also, and what was mentioned, is rotations. And a well-organized army in this kind of war will have rule months in and out of the front line. And some well-organized units in Ukraine have that. So you're in rest, you're in reserve, or you're on the front line, and you rotate on a 3-to-1 basis. Now, a lot of units don't do that because they're not particularly well led. And another issue is that there's a feeling, I think, amongst a lot of people, and you hear this not only in the media, but talking to people, including military officers and other ranks, that in some units there's a real deficit of leadership, which plays into this question of whether or not units are well managed, well led, or indeed leaders accountable for the mistakes they make. That's rather controversial, as you probably know, in Ukraine too.
Just on a side point on that thing of mobilization and demobilization, Amian, I mean, there are people who've been serving on the zero line, the front line, some since 2014, with few breaks in between, and some since the war broke out, and they haven't been able to return home to see their families. And then there are those who do not want to go to the front line, and they do not want to get conscripted. They do not want to answer the mobilization call. Is that causing problems in society? Because there are people back home in the cities, in Kyiv and Kharkiv or wherever, whose loved ones are serving on the front line, and then they might know other people who know people of a fighting age, but they're refusing to go. Is that disrupting friendships, for example?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I would not describe Ukraine as a divided society. They've held together in terms, like, in a way that you might not have expected given the circumstances that they're living through. But of course, there's a tension in society that it's very perceptible. It hasn't turned into a full-on conflict, and I don't think it will, but it's very perceptible. It's like in any war, you have the home front and you have the front line. So there's always that tension there. In the beginning of the war, there was a sense that the men and women who signed up to go sacrifice their lives, they were the national heroes, and they enjoyed that role. And they didn't criticize anybody who stayed at home because everybody knows a country can't send every single citizen to go fight. So there was an understanding. I think now that understanding has broken down a little bit given the lack of manpower at the front, the lack of soldiers. And one thing that I heard in December when I sat a bunch of soldiers down, I made a little studio in my hotel, and I had soldiers come to me in Kyiv and just talk to me for an hour, 2 hours sometimes about their thoughts about the war. And one guy, he actually said it off camera, otherwise I would play it for you guys, but it's really stuck with me. He is in the 3rd Assault Brigade, and he's seeing some of the worst fighting. He was in Bakhmut, and he moved up to Kharkiv. He's really always there where it's the worst. And he said he came back for a little bit of rest in Kyiv. 2 things happened to him. The first was he got his car towed, and that just it angered him so bad that he had to like take a half a day off and not talk to anybody. Second thing is he went to the gym just to get a little exercise, and he saw these guys there that were absolutely ripped. They were just looking like they were having they're in the best shape of their life. They're like 6 feet tall, super tan, like ripped, just working on their abs and their shoulders. And he's like, don't tell me this guy has a medical
deformity. A broken fingernail.
Wow.
I mean, these are all just, I'm not saying this to say that there's a bunch of people in Kiev who are avoiding the draft and could fight, but I'm saying that it is hard for a soldier who's been fighting for 2 years to go to a gym in Kiev and see somebody who's in better shape than him who's not fighting. And I think that's understandable for anybody who's seen fighting.
Frank, can I just ask you, just based on what Armin was saying, there was tremendous enthusiasm at the start of the war. People were volunteering by the thousands to join up. And now that is not happening in that much of a quantity. Was there a particular point in the war that turned the tide when it came to people volunteering?
I would suggest that would be autumn last year with the failure of the counteroffensive. And I think one of the issues there was and remains still, Biresh, messaging. You know, this idea that we're going to win the war in the end, somehow we'll develop some magic weapon, or the F-16s will do it for us, or whatever. And at a sort of lower level, the counteroffensive represented the same dynamic, that, you know, this was going to be a great success. We were going to penetrate Russian lines and everything would be great. And the centre of gravity was Crimea. And of course, none of it happened. And now I think the realization is sinking in. It has sunk in since, I mean, Armian will know this better than me, but I would suspect it'd be later part of last year. I want to gloss on something, if I might, and I couldn't agree more with what Armian said just there. I mean, I remember talking to a friend of mine whose boyfriend was in an artillery unit in Donetsk just a while ago, near the start of the war, and I saw the same thing as Armian spoke about, lots of fit young men in Kiev, and asked my friend, what's all this? She said, well, some wounds you cannot see. She meant it, of course, quite ironically. But I decided to sit in a cafe in the centre of Kiev and over 5 minutes count the number of people who are evidently not serving in the military, men between the ages of mid-20s to late 30s. And it took me 5 minutes to count to 100 on not a particularly busy day in busy afternoon in Kiev. And so if you are coming back on leave, or for that matter, a foreigner in the city, it's very evident that for many people, this is not a country at war. And I won't even discuss the number of SUVs that would be better served on the line than on the streets cruising around centre of the big cities.
So there's a lot of CEOs working out at the gyms in Kyiv?
Seems
potentially?
So.
And most of them happen to be younger CEOs. But just on the point of conscription, I mean, is conscription the end-all, be-all? Is that the answer? And the reason I'm asking you this is because former commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, who, as I understand now, is the ambassador to the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, I think he had written something about using technology to try and bridge the gap when it comes to resources between Ukraine and Russia. And technology in the form of, for example, more sophisticated drones, unmanned systems for better targeting, so you can be more efficient in your campaign against the Russians. Is that something that Ukraine can potentially focus more on if this conscription and mobilization isn't working out the way they would like it to?
I don't think they could make any more efforts than they're making now in R&D and technology acceleration. They've a superb initiative called Brave One, which brings ideas to the battlefield, or intends to, and does actually within six weeks. That was their aspiration, and they do seem to be doing that. But look, the brutal fact is that Russia's economy is 10 times that of Ukraine, and its manpower reserve is 3 to 4 times that. And I would suggest that this is something of a counsel, not of desperation, but of hope. I think concerning technology, for what it's worth, Ukraine is in the medium term much better served by looking at the way it trains, it deploys and organises its armed forces and learns lessons from the battlefield. And there are mechanisms you can put up, this is military staff work, military training and doctrine. And these things don't produce results in a few weeks, but they do, or they will do in the medium term. Because right now it's a hand-to-mouth for Ukraine. I don't think they're looking sufficiently assiduously into that longer term. The F-16s is one token of that, but there needs to be a lot more work on the way the force is structured into the future. I don't think that work is being done in the way it should. And that's where the West could get involved without being kinetic, without sending combat troops or even combat trainers into Ukraine. This is something about organising the force and ensuring that lessons are captured and applied. And that means you don't keep people in the line, as we discussed before. You filter them in and out of the line into training units to capture that experience, but also at the higher level to make sure that, Ukraine is in but just finish with this, a really superb position, and of course it is already, to lead European military development. I think a lot of that experience is not being captured, partly because they haven't developed or employed the techniques to do so. I think it's quite urgent that they do that over the next year or so. I hope they will. And that, as I say, that's where Western military assistance, without killing anybody or putting anybody in particular risk, can be really effective. I don't think it's been done.
Let's talk about the near term and this year that you're talking about. In terms of battle plans, in terms of what we see on the battlefield, what should Ukraine be doing, given that it is on the back foot now and Russia is repeatedly attacking the Eastern Front, trying to seize some important towns there? What do you see Ukraine doing? How does Ukraine need to respond in the next few months, if we are talking about a longer term after that?
Well, right now, as we speak, the Ukrainians are in the middle of a really promising effort to retake the town of Vovchansk, much of which has been captured in the recent sort of so-called Kharkiv offensive. And the reason they're recapturing that area, though, and I suspect they may well do so in the next few weeks, if Russia doesn't deploy any more troops there, is because they have an overmatch in numbers. They've deployed probably 2 to 3 times the amount of the number of Russian troops in the area, and deployed that much of their ordnance too, as I understand. But in the rest of on the rest of the line, they're losing ground pretty much every day, incrementally 50 metres there, here 100 metres there, and over a period of time that tells. I think what they're doing, though, from looking at it at a distance, is the right thing. They're not holding on to untenable defences. They're conducting what you or I might call tactical withdrawals or expedient retreats where they need to, and they're not. They're trading land for time, and they're focusing on keeping casualties as low as they possibly can. At least one expects so. The problem is, though, I think that's the perception we get. I don't know whether that's the reality across the line. If it is, then General Syrski, who's the commander-in-chief, has very much changed his approach, because he had a reputation for being somewhat, I won't say cavalier, but very much in the Soviet mould, which is to say, if I order you to take that position or hold it, you take it at whatever cost, or you hold it at whatever cost. And that, of course, is an attitude that leads to defeat. And in some places, I think the Ukrainians have abandoned that attitude, and in others, they're holding on to it, which is where they do take heavy casualties. I think they should be careful. Well, I'm not. Who am I to give advice? But the question was, what's going to be happening, and what should the Ukrainians do over the next few months? Trade land for time, hold on, build effective defences, there are no nostrums for this. They're in trouble. I think they'll hold. I think that we haven't discussed the Russians yet. What the Russians have not demonstrated is any capability to exploit breakthroughs that they make insofar as they do. Mm-hmm. They are taking huge losses too. They are not learning as quickly, I suspect, as the Ukrainians are. But what they do have is that preponderance of numbers. They don't these raw meat attacks that we heard about, they usually don't happen. They're not stupid, the Russians, but they are cavalier with human life when they need to be. And however, I don't think that balances out the attritional issue here. The centre of gravity in this war, it's currently an attritional war, is not technology, it's not artillery shells, it's not F-16s, and it's not air power, it's manpower, which brings us right back to the central topic of this discussion. I can't really say too much more than that.
Can we talk for a minute about the burden that Ukraine is carrying in this war, and on an individual level, Ukrainians? We have people in the comments talking about that, talking about how Ukraine is really fighting a war that many in Europe or the U.S. would not participate in themselves, but are depending on Ukraine to win. Two people here. We've got Mark Faraday saying it is a European war on European soil, and Ukraine should not be carrying this burden alone, but every nation in Europe should be sending troops to Ukraine. And then we have Jamie S. saying, if everything had been delivered when Ukraine had asked for, instead of saying no, the war would be in Crimea and outside Donetsk and Luhansk cities right now. So what mistakes, I mean, this leads to a lot of questions, but what burden is Ukraine carrying for Europe at this time? I put that to you, Frank.
Let's deal first with Western. So, thank you. Let's deal with the first question, or first issue that was raised, and that's Western troops. There are huge misconceptions amongst, I think, many people in most Western countries, particularly European countries, as to the efficiency and capability of their armed forces. Let me talk about the UK. I won't touch any of the other major players. Now, the UK can deploy, even if it wanted to, probably one brigade with all its gear. That's bearing in mind, I think the Ukrainians now have about 100 brigades, some of them quite small, some of them bigger. A brigade is a unit of about 5 to 8,000 people with all their gear, with all their tanks, artillery, and all the rest of it. UK can deploy one brigade, maybe two at a push. With a year's notice, it might be able to lay down another, by which time, of course, the first waves would be gone. So we don't, and that's the UK. It's probably the second or third military power. The biggest military power from a ground perspective is Turkey. It's not getting involved, forget that. And that's probably the most powerful force in Europe, in the air and on the ground. But we forget them, and we can do so for the purposes of this. Poland is growing, but not yet equipped or ready conceptually, I think, to intervene. It could probably deploy a similar force, perhaps slightly larger than that of the British. Germany is having problems organising 5,000 people to go to Lithuania by 2027, and the other countries can be disregarded. So that's the position. Air power is something different. NATO air power is extremely formidable and would defeat the Russian Air Force. It would take huge losses in doing so, which brings me to the final point on this, which is how much do you feel lucky? Okay, I don't mean that facetiously, because there will come a point where Russia may decide to escalate this. I'm not going to mention the N word, nuclear word, beyond just passing, but there are all kinds of things that Russia can escalate to, an escalator that would make life very unpleasant for Europe. So before those decisions are made, those considerations have to be taken into account. Lack of capability and consequences were Western troops to become into direct contact with Russians. Bearing in mind, throughout this Cold War, which we won, the rule was we don't put Western troops right next to Soviet ones. We don't have them formally in combat, and that was a successful strategy. Ukraine is bearing the burden of this war, but one word that came out of that is win. And I've written down here, what does winning mean? And there you have to draw the balance between what is possible and what you want. Because war does not favour the good guys or the bad guys. War has a dynamic all its own, and it has to be fought having in mind what your objectives are and what reality dictates to you. And that's another huge discussion.
Can I talk a bit about the Russians? Because you were talking about that earlier before you started answering this question. And thanks for that reality check on European countries and their military capability. The one on Germany came as no surprise to us, but it was interesting to hear what the UK can do. Just when it comes to the Russians, they have a numerical advantage when it comes to manpower. They also have an advantage when it comes to resources, when it comes to military equipment, for example. You are saying that Russia is not capitalizing on the gains that they are making on the front line. Is that a deliberate strategy, or is that just incompetence? And do you see Russia drawing on perhaps more reserves to maybe push for an offensive in the next few months?
I'll deal, Baresh, with the last question first. It's possible that they will. I suspect their summer offensive has started. And what they're doing is not focusing on ground, but on imposing costs on Ukraine. So they're playing to their strengths, which are in artillery and drones, electronic warfare to defend against Ukrainian drones and to a lesser extent artillery. So what they will be, their objective is to accelerate that process of imposing casualties on the Ukrainians, put pressures on their manpower situation, and with the expectation at some point they will crack. That's where the human component comes in, the moral component, as we call it in war, which is the Ukrainian resilience and will to defend their land, which is likely to prevail. It's not Russian incompetence. They have, Ukrainians have the same problem, and that is that it's they haven't time to train, or evidently haven't time to train their troops in the difficult and not only time-consuming but resource-consuming task of combined arms warfare. We saw what happened when the Ukrainians tried that during the counteroffensive. The Russians can't do it either, for much the same reasons. You can't do it with a few weeks training. It's an integrating systems of systems and applying them against a formidable enemy, which is ready for you. Now, the Ukrainians have proved they can't do that, and they're unlikely to be able to in the near future, and certainly the Russians can't. But from the Russian perspective, that's not a problem. They want to hammer away and attrit, as we say, the Russians, the Ukrainians, to a point where resistance becomes, if not not necessarily no longer possible, but breaking the will of the Ukrainian army, which of course they won't do. But that's why the Russians are fighting as they are, and that's why I would suggest what we're not going to see is some huge offensive somewhere, say in the north or Sumy or Kupiansk or wherever. We're going to see this grinding on to apply and impose costs on the Ukrainians, just like the Germans and the British and the French did in the First World War for the same reason.
Well, and talking about morale in Ukraine, also among the civilian population, I think you would see a huge effect on willingness to fight if you saw the circumstances that we saw at the beginning of the war. So what Frank was just talking about is this kind of, no matter what happens in the next 6 months, nobody's really expecting like a huge surprising advance on either side now. And that has an effect on conscription. That has an effect on how many young men are willing to sign up to go die on a frozen front line. Talking to one soldier actually this trip who was telling me that you would probably see a lot more people rushing to the conscription offices like you did at the beginning of the war. It wouldn't be the same long lines because a lot of those people are already serving, but you would see a lot more people willing to fight if they thought their way of life was put back into danger, because Kiev is very far away from the front lines at this moment, and that doesn't mean that they've forgotten about the war. It just means that the possibility does not seem that likely that Kiev will fall to the Russians anytime soon, but a lot of people would be willing to defend Kiev, put their life on the line. Maybe that guy at the gym with the big shoulders and the six-pack, if he saw that his gym was under attack, all of a sudden, maybe he would pick up a gun.
You've got to target the gyms. That's where it hurts. You've got to hurt the muscles. Frank, there is something I'd like to bring up. It is the variable that has come up in conversations often enough, and maybe you know what I'm getting at. I'd like to talk about a very important election that we're expecting in the next few months, the U.S. election. Does the result of the U.S. election, is that going to be pivotal to how 2025 shapes up in Ukraine?
I don't think anybody would be surprised with the answer. Absolutely central. And I think that the latest transfer of funds or announcement of it's actually a much longer series of funding, not only for military but civilian assistance that from the US Congress, of course, its strategic intention was to push the war into the last part of the year, to push it past the election, to avoid any crises that certainly would have happened, I think, this summer had that transfer not being made, had the Congress not agreed the injection of cash. And frankly, I think that there is an awful lot of hope being placed on this election. No, not frankly, I think everybody knows it, and nobody knows well, let's put it another way, were Trump to be elected, the war would, I suspect, end rather quickly with an extremely unsatisfactory, from Ukraine's perspective, deal, as the US would threaten to, or actually withdraw assistance. That would seem to be the most likely outcome of a Trump victory. But even a Biden victory, one of the problems with this whole thing, and I understand, I'll just say this for 30 seconds, but I think it's absolutely vital, is what exactly is the West's strategy here? We had 3 objectives mentioned by various senior American leaders over the last week. One was that we're aiming for the Ukrainians to hold the line effectively. That's from General Austin, the Defense Secretary. Another came from Biden's spokesman, who suggested or stated that President Biden's with the Ukrainian program of retaking Crimea and everything else. And yet another objective was to equip the Ukrainians for the long run, so that they can be put into, or that they could be put into a position where negotiations could take place. Now, which is it? Now, we have a long history over the last 25 years. All of us, I think, of one form or another have been on the receiving end of, which is a lack of Western grand strategy. Same in Afghanistan, same in Iraq. Don't need to get into all that. And it's the same here. What is our objectives? We know the Ukrainians' objectives, but we don't necessarily dance to that. What are ours? And that's not clear.
Amian, how do Ukrainians view the upcoming US election when you talk to them?
I still have yet, in 2 years of being in Ukraine, to meet a Ukrainian who likes Donald Trump. So I don't think that they see Biden as a great hero of our times necessarily. And I think maybe some people secretly like Trump, and just the way a lot of Americans think he's like just a fantastic character. But at the same time, it's very much obvious to a lot of Ukrainians that the reason why they've been able to hold out against Russia for 2 years is because of American weapons. And Trump has said repeatedly that he would not support Ukraine in this war against Russia, that he would end the war within 24 hours. I have actually a poll that was done recently that shows Ukrainians' attitudes toward the war. Let me just find the part that I'm looking for. Here we go. If you can pull that up. So this is a poll that was done in March 2024 that shows what Ukrainians think the objective of the war should be. So putting aside what Americans think it should be, this is what Ukrainians think, and it's changed a lot since the beginning of the war. 51% believe that the country should fight until it liberates all territory to the 1991 borders. So that is code for Crimea. Are the Ukrainians fighting to take back Crimea? Not many people thought that was possible at the beginning of the war, but it's been part of Zelensky's rhetoric. But it seems that just barely a majority of Ukrainians believe that that's what they should be fighting for. An additional 12% on top of that believes that it should be fought back to the February 2022 lines, so taking back parts of the Donbass and the regions of the south, Mariupol, that were conquered by Russia since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Another 8% defend its positions and focus on exhausting Russia, but not go on the offensive, so basically hold the line, as Lloyd Austin said. And 26% actually believe that it's time to seek a compromise through negotiations. At the beginning of the war, it was looking more, a little bit over 60% thought that they should take back Crimea, and it was a vast majority who believed that that no negotiations should be put on the table. But now with the frozen front line, it looks like people are changing their opinions.
Let's talk about that negotiation. And we'd also, I think, coming to the end of this conversation, Frank, if I can just get your final word on this. When it comes to negotiations, bearing in mind that we just had a Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland, they were talking about a pathway to peace. Are we anywhere near any sort of negotiations to end this war? Or is that still dependent on the outcome over the next few months on the battlefield?
What's surprising, well, first thing, what's surprising is Armian's poll there. It's very interesting how things are shifting. I suspect that blue segment of people thinking that this might be time for negotiations is going to increase over the next few months as some degree of war fatigue settles in. And certainly some of my friends, Ukrainian friends, on the quiet, very quietly beginning to say that. I've been talking to a couple of senior Ukrainians over the last week or so, and one detects that the beginnings of thinking about planning for realistic negotiations are in the air. But that's, we're looking way into the medium term. I just want to say one thing by way of final comment, that there's what should be done, which is your objectives, and what can be done, which is what you can actually achieve. It's finding the place on that delta. That's the sweet point, as it were, and I don't think we're anywhere near identifying where that place is on either side. Difference between the way things should be and the way things are. And unfortunately, as I said, war does not, it has no bias towards the good guys.
We'll leave it there on that thought. Frank Ledwidge, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you spared about more than 45 minutes of your time. I think I'd asked for something like 35. So thanks for staying extra and sharing that valuable insight with us, Frank. Take care and speak soon.
My pleasure, Varesh. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Armian, any final word on what you see happening in Ukraine? Your next trip coming up in Ukraine, what do you think is going to be happening on that one?
That's a good question. I don't know when I'm going back at this point, but it does seem like there's a new phase of the war now, just with people talking about conscription laws openly, whether or not they're for it or against it, talking about the idea that the objective of taking Crimea back is actually not, it's not feasible. Things like this that at the beginning of the war, they were taboo to talk about, and I think people genuinely believed that after Ukrainians successfully defended Kiev and that region from a huge Russian assault, that they would have the upper hand in this war because of morale, but it seems like morale is waning for a lot of people. I mean, this is not an issue of cowardice versus heroism. The 3rd Assault Brigade guy that I was talking to, who has seen the worst of the action, he said that he would be in favor of some kind of ceasefire, even if it wasn't permanent, even if that meant that in the future Ukraine would fight valiantly to take back Crimea at some point. He just believes that it's not possible with the way things are to really keep fighting indefinitely to take back Donbass. And what I said earlier, looking at the future of conscription, I do believe that the conditions in Ukraine, the idea that joining the military is a one-way ticket, the frozen frontline, these things have a huge effect on how young people in Ukraine see the possibility of joining the military, and it's not necessarily it's not unchangeable, right? So if they did feel that the entire identity of Ukraine was under threat again, as it was on February 2022, that you would see a lot more people volunteering to make bigger sacrifices for their country. And my final thought, too, in all of this, and I think going back to what people are saying in the chat, this big debate, I think, judge not lest ye be judged, to quote a famous book, because it is true that journalists, the duty is to report the situation on the ground, but you really, until you're really faced with, do I fight, do I give my life for my country, or do I protect my family and do the other things that society says are moral and good, stay alive and keep your children alive and have a beautiful family and everything like this, do I sacrifice that for my country or not? And I think that nobody can really know what their decision would be unless they're faced with that question.
And that is part of that question that we asked in the poll, didn't we, Cherry? I think the original question being, is conscription justified when a country is at war? And I wonder if you have any results for us, Cherry.
Yeah, I accidentally closed the poll slightly earlier, but nonetheless, we have 490 votes, which is quite good. Most of the people voted for the first option. No, it's not the first option, but most of the people chose no one should be forced to fight, which is 47%.
Wow.
27% thinks that only if everyone is treated fairly, and 24% thinks that there is no other way.
I mean, it's very interesting because these results sort of vindicate why we wanted this topic, right, in the first place, because if it's 47% of the people thinking no one should be forced to fight, that was one of the things that we discussed as to why conscription should not be a given, and there is a matter of choice, especially when it comes to democratic nations, and that choice needs to be there, right?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think, again, what you were saying, judge not lest ye be judged, it is very easy to kind of sit and move around the chess pieces on the board to say, this is what people should do to have the outcome you want. But unless you have skin in the game, unless you're asked to give up your life and go to the front line and perhaps lose it within days, It's a really intense decision. And also the people back at home. I think about the women I've met here in Berlin who have left Ukraine and have men, their loved ones fighting in the war. That's really scary. So my heart goes out to everyone who is making this decision. And I just want to go back to my final word here, something from Carolina Vilena. All of us want peace, and I definitely want that.
Peace
How
would
to
be a
get
bad
there,
thing.
that's a question.
That is a question. But thanks so much for joining in on this chat and this conversation. It is truly illuminating to hear your responses to the poll question and seeing all the comments and the observations that you all have made. Thanks also to Armian. Thanks so much for sharing your experience in Ukraine, bringing us that interview with Andy. Cherry, thanks so much for monitoring this chat. I've thoroughly enjoyed the questions that have come and the observations that have been made. I'm still surprised by the poll question, but it's very interesting to hear that response. It's very interesting because that's what we were discussing. I just keep going back to that.
Well, come back, everybody, next week because we'll have another question we're discussing. We're here every Wednesday, and we put up our question of the week about 24 hours ahead of time. So come back. We'll see you again.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.